I'm going to talk to you about learning how to learn. Learning how to learn is a meta skill. It's about the psychological and neurological principles underlying learning and how to learn most efficiently. Specifically, what I'm going to talk to you about is a course I took online through Coursera.org. It's a MOOC, a massive open online course. This course definitely changed how I approached learning, how I studied. And when I finished the course in early 2016 and I started my graduate degree in computer science, I actually found that my coursework was the easiest part of my degree. The classes were a lot easier to manage, and the research became the hardest part for me. I graduated with my master's degree in computer science with a 4.0 GPA, and I was inducted into the Honor Society Phi Kappa Phi for being one of the top 10% of graduates. This course really helped me to hone in and be efficient with my habits, and there were a couple of things that I thought were working which were actually illusions of competence, illusions of learning. But I highly recommend this course. It takes about 4 weeks of study. It's online, it's free. I'm going to go over a couple of things I took away from this course that were really impactful for me and helped me a lot. I've also released a summary. You can find the link down below. A summary of the course and everything that I've learned, some of the most important tips. Another big thing that I learned from this course is also spaced repetition and how you can learn something so that you never forget it for your entire life. Part of that is through an open source software that I really like. It's called Anki, A-N-K-I. So this is an online flashcard software. And as part of my study for this course, I actually converted the entire course into a deck of flashcards, and I'm releasing that online, so you can also find the link below. The course is called Learning How to Learn, Powerful Mental Tools to Help You Master Tough Subjects. You learn about learning modes, illusions of learning, memory techniques, and dealing with procrastination. One important psychological concept that I learned is that we have two main modes of thinking. We have a focus mode and a diffuse mode. Focus mode is that algorithmic step-by-step thinking. In the course, they tell you to think about it like almost like a thought is like a pinball. So in a focus mode, this thought shoots up in a pinball and it goes in a very directed path. Diffuse mode is very different. So in diffuse mode, it's those times where your mind is wandering, maybe you're walking around just thinking about something but nothing in particular. That's diffuse mode. What that really helps with is to integrate concepts and strengthen neural pathways. So you want a balance of both of these. Diffuse mode also helps you check what you're thinking and that you get a kind of global perspective. It activates different areas of your brain instead of just the short-term problem solving. So you always want to check your solutions by taking a quick break. The other key idea is chunking. So a chunk is kind of like this rock. It's just a little piece. Chunking is the mental leap which helps you unite bits of information through meaning. You can chunk both mental and physical tasks, but in this case we'll be talking mainly about mental chunks. So there's 3 parts to making a chunk. First, you want to give undivided attention to the subject that you're studying, which means no Netflix in the background, nothing else to distract you. Step 2 is to understand the basic idea of what you're trying to chunk. So, that means you want to have a good idea of what you're doing, probably read the whole passage of what you're trying to learn first, and understand the context of it. Because step 3 is practice and repetition of the chunk with context. So on average, we can only hold about 4 items in working memory at a time. So you can only have about 4 focuses of attention. So if you have a show on in the background or you're doing something else, then you're filling up at least one of those slots. This is why one of the keys is to really focus with undivided attention, focus entirely on the subject that you're learning. Once you start to see that the average person can only hold 4 items in working memory at a time, you start to see this kind of chunking all over the place. So think about phone numbers. Phone numbers are separated by 2 dashes and there's 3 chunks. When you learn a number, it's easier to think instead of 702, maybe 702, which makes the entire number sequence one number in your mind. Think about social security numbers, which are also broken up this way, credit cards. Basically what a knowledgeable person is someone who's built up a library of chunks. They have all these different skills, all this different information. Through uniting all of their chunks, they're able to come up with new and creative solutions. When you think about gaining knowledge and expertise in this way, you can see how it's a very gradual, long-term process. There's no need to rush or feel like you're behind. It's just slowly building up. Now, a really big topic is illusions of competence. So this is where, you feel like you got it, but when it comes to the test, you suddenly realize, wow, you didn't learn that. To break out of that, here's a couple of things that trick you into think you're learning when you're really not. Don't reread the material in the same session. So if you read something once and you're in the same study session, you haven't stopped, then don't reread the material. What you should do instead is test yourself. So ask yourself questions, try to recall what you were reading. The only time that rereading is useful is in a separate study session. So maybe a week later you'll reread some key passages. And in that case it's more of a spaced repetition, spaced practice, than it is really rereading. Testing yourself with flashcards can help you break out of thinking you know something. Don't underline or highlight as you're reading. With that, you don't really have the context of what you're underlining and highlighting, which is an important part. Instead, what you should do is write in the margins. So synthesize on the side of the paragraph the key information that you want to remember. This is much more involved than highlighting or underlining. Oh, another big problem with illusions of learning. Practicing the easy stuff without practicing the hard stuff. When you practice the easy problems and you kind of get going, then it can make you feel like you have a better sense of the material than you do. Deliberate practice is focusing on the most difficult parts first and then working your way down. This way you apply the most energy at the beginning with the hardest parts. One of the most powerful tools that you have to learn and remember is simply recall. So recall is mental retrieval of what you've learned. So just do this. Rather than underline, highlight, all that stuff, rereading, as you go through what you're learning, pause, look away, and think, what did I just learn? What are the key concepts of what I just read? And by doing that process, the actual mental retrieval will make that neuronal pathway in your mind stronger. The other important part here is mistakes are good. Mistakes show you where your gap in learning is. So don't feel bad. This is a good thing. Go back, and if you can't remember or recall what you think you should, check again and see what you missed. Another important key here is interleaved practice. So interleaved practice is different than massed practice. So let's say that you have 3 subjects that you want to learn. Then maybe a natural way to go about it is that you would think, all right, so I'm going to study this for an hour and a half, and then the second subject for an hour and a half, and then the third subject. Studies have shown that by mixing up your learning time and mixing up the type of problems that you're practicing on, that actually makes you learn better. And it makes the concepts and the chunks more ingrained in your mind. If you think about it, learning isn't just the skill of gaining chunks, it's also learning when and where to select the chunks and skills that you have based on the context. So mix up your learning. Learn and practice from problems of different chapters in the same subject, or even different areas, and that way you keep your brain fresh. A big part of learning is emotions. Emotions do matter here. Emotions affect your perception, learning, memory, attention. An effective learner is someone who is happy or calm or at peace, and ineffective is someone who is stressed or afraid. So it's important that if you feel like you're not making progress in learning, take a moment to pause and think about how you're feeling. What are your emotions at that time? I've worked with a lot of people who struggle with procrastination, and I've definitely struggled with procrastination myself. Might have even struggled and procrastinated to make this video. Procrastination is actually an emotion regulation issue. People often wonder, why do they procrastinate? Doesn't it seem like it doesn't make sense? But really the brain is just trying to do what you want. It's trying to protect you. When you set out on a task, usually there's a spike in discomfort. So we feel uncomfortable. What your brain is trying to do is recognize that and shift your attention to something that is less unpleasant, more pleasant. But that's the key as to why procrastination is a self-reinforcing behavior. In the course, Learning How to Learn, they break down habits into 4 parts. First, you have the cue, then you have the routine, then there's the reward, and finally, the belief about that habit. And this is how they define the habit loop. So the cue is any feeling or sensation, it could be a location, the thing that leads you to the routine. And the routine could be anything. In this case, for procrastination, it could be something like checking social media or playing hacky sack. So the routine can be the zombie thought pattern. So maybe this is even something like YouTube, where you check your home feed, click on a video, mindlessly watch for a couple of hours. The reward, this is what's needed to actually rewire your brain for a new habit. So the reward depends on what the routine is. Then there's the belief around the habit. Do you think that this is good for you? Do you have enough time? What are you thinking about this? So let's go back to procrastination as a habit. So in this case, the first step, the cue is often the discomfort we feel when starting out on a task. So once you get that cue, that's where you start to fall into these negative procrastination habits. Then you get a routine, whatever your routine is for procrastination. Maybe it's texting people or reading. Maybe it's doing other things that aren't necessarily important right now, but they're easier for you and more pleasant. Then there's the reward. And this is why procrastination is self-reinforcing, because typically the discomfort you feel from doing a procrastination habit is less than what you would feel by doing the actual task you should be doing. It's somewhat of a reward because it's also less pain. Of course, if you're doing a fun procrastination habit, then that can be an actual reward. Then there's the belief around the habit. So what is that belief? Why did you procrastinate? And that takes some self-reflection. Do you feel like you have enough time? Do you feel like you deserve it? What is the belief? Now, willpower really only needs to be applied at one place, and that's in handling the cue. If you can handle that cue before you get to the routine, then you can break yourself out and switch to a different routine. That's the only place you need to apply willpower. Once you've fallen into a routine, you're going through the motions. You're already in that zombie thought mental pattern. So with procrastination, there's the cue, which is the feeling of discomfort. There's the routine, which is a temporary distraction. There's the reward, which is temporary relief. And there's the belief, which is a justification. What I try to get people to recognize is that we often in our brains, when we have a task, so let's say that we need to write a 4-page essay or a memo. When we sit down to do that, our brain is constantly trying to check the distance to our objective. So if I sit down and I say, okay, I need to write a 4-page essay, then in my mind, as I go through it, as I'm writing and I start the first paragraph, my brain is really thinking, I have 4 more pages to write of this and I'm only on the first page. So that distance to the objective, the distance to the reward, creates a feeling of discomfort and unease. The way to counteract procrastination, the best way, is to try to eliminate that process, that sub-module in your mind that is constantly measuring the distance to the objective. What's much better is to get into the flow of the process. So this is why there's a difference between the process versus the product. The product is the end result of the process. So the process is how you get to the end product. So you want to be focusing on the process. It's kind of like people who want to be rock stars, but they don't enjoy practicing guitar. Most often, the people who become rock stars are the people who just love playing guitar. They don't need to apply willpower to play the guitar. One effective way of focusing on the process instead of the product is to use something called the Pomodoro Technique. This was invented by an Italian educator, and it goes something like this. I'll link to the Wikipedia page below. Pomodoro actually means tomato in Italian. He used a little tomato timer. He set it for 25 minutes, and you work for a 25-minute session. So you say, okay, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna write for 25 minutes. Then when the timer goes off, you take a 5-minute break. So that could mean getting up, walking around, doing something that doesn't require a lot of focus. When the timer goes off again, then you go back for another Pomodoro. So that's 25 more minutes of simply, let's say, writing, and then take another 5-minute break, and then do another Pomodoro. After 3, you can take a longer break, which could be 10 to 20 minutes, however long. And what this does is, when you sit down, you're writing for a certain time. The distance for how long you're writing is set for you by the length of the Pomodoro. You don't have to think about the distance to the objective, to the product. All you should be thinking about is just working for that set amount of time, and it's going to take you however many Pomodoros it takes you to finish. What's really cool about this too is that you can set the duration yourself. If you have a shorter attention span, a slightly longer attention span, increase or decrease your Pomodoro time. I've personally used the Pomodoro Technique a lot. It's been super helpful for me, and a great thing to do is tackle your most difficult task first thing in the morning. So after you wake up, then you should do your first Pomodoro and get the hardest stuff out of the way first. That's when you have your most energy. Of course, in learning, memory is very important. There's been a lot of research on memory. Something that I found very interesting was the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It showed that much of our memory is likely an inverse exponential decay. So, from the moment we learn something, it sharply decreases. However, if you use spaced repetition, which means that you remind yourself of the fact that you learned the next day, and maybe the next day and the next day, then that forgetting curve changes its shape and you'll remember what you learned much longer. The intervals for spaced repetition changes depending on your comfort, how easily it was for you to retrieve that information. As long as you keep practicing, eventually you'll only need to remind yourself of a fact once per year. And after that, you can remember it for your entire life. So I would want to ask you too, what's something that's so important to you that you would want to remember it for your entire life? This is also where an excellent flashcard system like Anki comes in. Anki reminds you at optimal intervals of when you should be reminded of some key piece of information. If you use it at least every once in a while, you should have a near optimal rate of reminders as the software automatically keeps track of the spaced intervals for you. Of course, you can use any other software you want. You can also use flashcards. Many people just go through their flashcards once every 5 days. Another key insight is that the human memory is very spatially and visually centered. So you could do a fun little experiment right now. Let me ask you, and don't look around, how many windows do you have in your home? So take a second to think about it. You can pause this video if you want. But here's what most people do if you ask them this question, is they sit back and they think about it, and what they're doing in their mind is they're walking around in their mind's eye through their home and counting off the windows. We have a strong spatial visual memory for places that we've been. This comes back from an evolutionary history. Knowing where our encampment was, knowing where to get food, knowing where to get water, all of that was essential to our survival. So one thing that we can do in an academic setting is tap into this visual spatial memory and apply what we're learning into the domain of space and sight. A very effective technique for this is the memory palace technique. I won't go too in depth with this here. I think there's a lot of great resources online. The memory palace technique is where you use an area that you're very familiar with, so a home, a campus, somewhere you've been to often, and you place unusual visual reminders there. If you memorize a list of grocery items and you need to pick up a dozen eggs, you might remember that by thinking about your childhood home and there's a bunch of giant smashed eggs right on the doorstep before you walk into the house. And you can think, oh, I'm going to have to step over these eggs just to get inside. And if you want to get milk, then you can imagine a kiddie pool filled with milk as soon as you walk in the door. By creating these visual spatial scenes, you make something very novel and interesting that your mind will not let you forget. By applying this technique to other lists of items that you need to learn, you can keep it very strong and fresh in your mind. The more senses you use, the better. So if you can get in space, sight, essentially the harder you make your brain work to process that information, the more it's going to sink in. So if you want to translate what you're learning into a second language, or if you want to write it down in pencil, that writing actually helps you more than typing it up would. Of course, another important technique are acronyms, where every letter of the word stands for another word. And you can see how, again, acronyms are really just chunks of chunks. The acronym itself is a chunk, and then each word is another chunk, relating to a bunch of different concepts. Something that can be tough for a lot of people is feeling like they don't have enough intelligence to be a good student, to be a good academic. And the truth is, what people consider being smart is often just having a good working memory. So we talked about how there's the 4 slots in working memory, that we can hold on to about 4 things. Well, most people who find school or math or those types of subjects to be easier, they tend to have up to 4 to 9 slots of focuses and attention. So they're able to juggle a lot of concepts, they rarely lose attention, their mind holds on to things like a bulldog. But there's a downside to having this too. People of this level of working memory are prone to something called Einstellung. Einstellung is a German word, and it means getting into a fixed mindset. You become less able to be a flexible, creative thinker. A person with a strong working memory is able to remember all the steps to a solution for a problem they've solved before. But sometimes problems require new and creative solutions. Well, losing attention is actually like swapping out one of those memory slots that we have for working memory. When that happens, what's in your mind starts to mix around a little more, and you get more creative solutions. So they're more resistant to Einstellung and can truly see a problem with a fresh perspective. And often that fresh perspective is very useful with deliberate practice. So by practicing the hardest parts, by sticking with it, you can raise yourself to the level of a natural genius. But it takes a lot of practice. Science, work, any field. But any field that you want to get into, we really need all kinds of people. We need the people who have a great memory for past solutions so that we know we're going down the right path. We have the people who know how to work hard and keep at it and have more creative solutions. And by combining the two, we get the best of both worlds. So I would just say, whether you're a D student, a C student, B, or an A student, you need to be able to flexibly work with other people and apply yourself to your greatest strengths. Another big part of learning is taking tests. One educator, Richard Felder, created a test checklist, so you can go step by step and check if you're ready. Another important tool is hard start, jump to easy. So you work on a hard problem, work until you get stuck, go to an easier problem. While you work on that easier problem, your brain is working in the background on solving that harder problem. So hopefully when you go back to it, in that kind of diffuse mode, then you'll have a greater insight into how to solve the harder problem. A big part of taking tests is also handling stress. Again, emotions matter. So something that's helpful here are breathing techniques, like meditation. You would want to do deep breathing from your stomach to help you relax for a test. It's better to not do this just when you're testing. You'd want to do it outside of the test too, in areas where you feel calm and relaxed. That way you get the whole process going for when you need it. A lot of tests are multiple choice, but this actually activates something different than recall. It activates recognition. So often when you see a bunch of answers, you can recognize the answer you've seen before. A trick here to help you study better is to cover up the multiple choice questions and try to recall what you think the right answer is. And that way, when you look at the test, you can recall, hopefully you see the answer that you recalled. Remember to take a big picture perspective. So that might mean stepping away for a minute, a couple of minutes, to let your mind wander, and when you come back to the problem, you might be able to recognize that you are getting too narrowly focused and that your answer doesn't really make sense. And having that global perspective allows you to see that. Remember to rest before a big test. Just like in an athletic competition or lifting, you don't want to train super hard the day before. You want to make sure your brain and your body are at its freshest. So all of these tips had a big impact on me. One of the biggest things too was I would often, as a kid, and I realized this was really bad later, but I would read a question and think, Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can solve that. I think I know the answer. There's no need for me to actually go through and solve it. The real practice comes from solving the problem. So you can't just look at it. You got to work it all the way out. Chances are that if you're studying and it feels like a technique or some type of habit takes a lot of mental energy, that's the habit that you should be doing. That's the habit that's really effective. So don't get lulled into the easy stuff. So again, the course gets into all of this at a much deeper level. This is a good overview. I hope it's gotten you interested in the course and just learning how to learn in general. I'd like to ask you if there's anything in this video that you realized, oh my gosh, I did that and I need to stop doing that. Or is there some other learning technique that when you learned it, it gave you a great insight in how to learn better? Please leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.